Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this Thursday night in-depth ag forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. Well, this video is going to be the last one I do for 2022. I'm going to take Friday off and actually spend all of next week with family, just getting recharged before we start 2023. So I'll talk to you again in the new year, but seeing that it's kind of my last video, I thought it'd be interesting just to do kind of a retrospective. Let's just look back on 2022. And the map you've been looking at while I've been talking here shows you the 2022 billion-dollar weather disasters put together by NOAA. So each of the icons there represents a different event that happened this year that had cost at least $1 billion according to NOAA's metrics. There's been quite a bit of severe weather this particular year, and I'm going to show you kind of another way to look at that severe weather. One of my favorite websites here from the Storm Prediction Center actually gives you an annual severe weather report, and this is showing data up to December 19th. And so each one of these red dots represents the over 1,300 tornadoes that were observed across the United States this year. And as you just look back, there were, of course, numerous tornadic thunderstorm events, but one of the things that I'm just drawn to here is how Mississippi into Alabama seem to have been the kind of epicenter of where we've had multiple outbreaks. We had outbreaks early in the year. We had them late in the year down here in the south. And this is one of the great things I like about this site is you can actually go back and look at when each of those individual events occurred. Now from tornadoes, I want to go over to hail. And when you look at these dots, it shows you where we've had hail throughout the year. And I remember several events, but one of the ones that just really catches my attention here as I think about this past year was the storm system that came out on June 7th into June 8th. It started in Montana, cut through Wyoming, South Dakota, hit Nebraska very hard, and into Kansas. That one event there was one of those billion-dollar weather events from this year. And then from here, let's go look at the number of wind damage reports. And you can see that this is by far our most common type of severe weather when it comes to thunderstorms in terms of producing damage. And again, the numerous events this year, including the derecho that hit parts of the eastern Corn Belt, and then the one that came here in May that went through parts of Nebraska into South Dakota and Minnesota. That was the one that destroyed a lot of the pivot irrigation in Nebraska. So that's not to diminish the effects of these other events. Those are just ones that kind of stick out in my head. But when I come back and I think back in years from now about what 2022 was, I'll probably remember it most for this figure. So this is from January 1st up until the 22nd of December of this year, looking at precipitation ranks by climate district. You know, I love to show you these maps from Iowa State. We remember that back early in the year, especially from late winter through early spring, the jet stream just targeted, coming into the Pacific Northwest and exiting through parts of the northern plains, keeping things very, very cold, but also very wet throughout much of the northern tier of the United States. The lack of that good jet stream flow produced very dry conditions from January through March and April before the dry season into California, and also enhanced the effect of the rain shadow coming off the Rocky Mountains. Then we saw in midsummer a large ridge of high pressure that set up right here. And even though it doesn't seem like it's reflected in this, given how wet things were before and after, we saw, remember, in midsummer, the driest summer conditions on record right into this area. But that drove a very active southwest monsoon, but it also produced this large ring in through here of very dry conditions that we continue to see build throughout the summer. And that's just to highlight a few of these different areas. But when you look at this map and you take away these ranks, remember that you can also compare this to our newest drought monitor, which still shows an extensive amount of land area in some form of drought. So when I often give you statistics on what, how deep we are in drought, I pull that from this time series. And if you just kind of hover here over the end, you'll actually get the latest data. So according to this, if you go from D0, which is just abnormally dry, all the way to D4, which is exceptional drought, we still have about 75 to 78% of the land area in the lower 48 in some form of drought. And so the top question that I'm going to go after from now all the way through the rest of winter is what is this map going to look like come spring? Because when you think about an upcoming summer forecast east of the Rocky Mountains, an upcoming summer forecast east of the Rocky Mountains, there's only two factors that show statistical correlation that is significant enough to use as a forecasting metric for a season like next spring and next summer. And one of them is soil moisture. So we'll have to watch to see how this map changes between now and April. I'm going to give you a hint at least to what I think it's going to do here in a few moments. But I do expect, just bigger picture, I do expect this drought picture to change and decrease significantly over the coming days and weeks. Okay, from there, I really want to just hit on something that was very important about 2022. This is a map of velocity potential, and you need to look at it as a way of thinking about how the atmosphere in the tropics breathes, all right? So this year, where you see the blues, we had negative velocity potentials. That means air is going up. We had a lot of rising motion over Indonesia, north of Australia. And in this particular area, what we saw throughout much of this year were westerly winds coming from this direction near the surface and strong easterly winds coming from that direction. These are all the behavior in the trade winds. So air was forced to rise in this area. It then kind of crossed the Pacific deep in the atmosphere back this way, and then it sank over here. And what was important about that is what it did to the way that the momentum ejected out of the tropics into the mid-latitudes and what it did to the jet stream pattern. Because the jet stream pattern throughout this year favored, especially in spring and a lot during summer, more ridging in the midsection of the United States than we'd seen in a very long time. So the point behind me stressing this is because this past year, what drove this pattern, which remember, our planet's weather systems are born out of the exhaustion of heat from the tropics toward the poles. So that's where it's all born. So we have to watch this carefully. But when we think back to maybe what drove that particular setup, a lot of MJO 456, okay, that's right there over Indonesia, is what we're continuing to see right now. And that is the presence of this La Niña. Now remember, whenever you see the colder ocean temperatures here, which is upwelling of colder water from below, this is driven by stronger than normal trade winds out of the east right here across the equatorial Pacific. This particular year, they were met with stronger westerly wind bursts coming out of the Indian Ocean. I think you've probably heard me say that 1,000 times. Now, that particular setup in the atmosphere, that La Niña setup, affects the way the jet stream behaves. And throughout much of summer and now into fall and winter, we've seen a lot of blocking in the Pacific. Okay, and that's been critical. As we move from summer into fall and now into winter, we not only had blocking in the Pacific, but also saw it in the Atlantic. And if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about here, it's these big ridges. You see from September 1st all the way up until the 19th of December, we saw the jet stream come around and off of Japan, but run into a block, this ridge. So it was forced to go north of it like this and south of it like that. And at times it would come diving in like it did this fall into the Pacific Northwest and eject its systems across the country. But there'd be another high latitude blocking ridge that was over Greenland. You see, highly amplified patterns have more north-south movement than west to east. And throughout all of this past year, a lack of good zonal flow versus meridional flow is what tended to drive the drought deeper and deeper into places that we saw it. And these are just kind of two of the components most recently. Now, I bring all of that up because I want to show you some changes. And these changes are going to be important as we start to talk about 2023. Because from now through January 6th, the newest European model update for the next 15 days clearly does not have a blocked pattern in it. Because look how wet things are extending from the Gulf of Alaska into the West Coast. This will also create multiple systems that will be born on the Rocky Mountains. Or let me rephrase that. Refreshed by the Rocky Mountains and spin up as systems that roll across the rest of the United States. That's what the next 15 days looks like. And the reason for that is right here. You see, over the next several days, getting into the couple of days following Christmas, we will finally see the jet stream level winds, which are going to leave China and Japan, extended to the Pacific, not run into a large blocking ridge between, Hawaii and Alaska. No big ridges here that push up to the Chukchi Sea or the Arctic. And nothing on the downwind side of it over by Greenland, at least being advertised at this point. This is zonal flow, much more west to east than north to south. It keeps things active, especially across the West Coast, but it also prevents major swings in temperature. We clearly do not have zonal flow today. We have a massive Arctic outbreak today, but this is where we're going, and I wanted to cover the long range first in tonight's video. So when we now look at the new data that comes from the ECMWF weeklies, I'm back into more agreement with it. The last few videos I've said, gosh, the weeklies are not making a lot of sense to me. It seems as though now that the new forecast for the month of January is falling better in line with what we talked about on Monday, which was the CPC forecast. That was better onshore flow in the west, more systems rolling through the United States, including an active Ohio River Valley storm track, near normal precipitation through the Canadian Prairie, the plains of the United States, and possibly quite active up the East Coast. I buy into this. I think January is going to be a very kind of tumultuous month with respect to the frequency at which systems are going to come across the United States. But when you lack the deep meridional flow, instead of having these just huge swings in temperatures like we're dealing with now, things I think are going to be more flat, a bit more zonal in the flow. And we're going to see, as a result of that, a bit more of a mild, longer range forecast. And we're going to do that again in just a few seconds here. So what's the other part of this? If we keep this going, I showed you this on Monday, but I want to just reiterate that I expect that La Niña will begin to loosen its grip very soon, like within the next 20 to 30 days. And as it begins to loosen that grip, those strong trade winds are going to start to back off. The MJO will begin to move around. And we are still projecting that at some point in late winter, early spring, that we should start to see the jet stream behave more like El Niño. And you may say, well, what does that mean? This is what it means. It's going to do more of this. That's what we're talking about. It's all about the impact. If you're in North America, it's all about the impact that El Niño and La Niña have on these winds. And so we expect there to be just better westerly flow. All right. Now, it's not just us in the States that are looking at this. I want to show you another component to this. There's a graphic here of what's called the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole. And the Indian Ocean Dipole, whenever there's a La Niña, tends to be negative. So you can see that for the last few years, it's been negative. Last time it was positive was when we came off of a big El Niño event here. And this is the one that sent the record heat and drought into Australia. But where we are now is the Indian Ocean Dipole has now come back up above and is in neutral condition. That means the Indian Ocean is no longer, for lack of a better description, kind of playing along with the La Niña in the way that it had. So just to show you one last point here, when looking at the Bureau of Meteorology out of Australia, they like to summarize their forecast against the Canadians, the Europeans, the Japanese, the French here in the United States, and then also the British, on whether or not we continue to see chances for La Niña or neutral or El Niño. So already by January, more neutral conditions. By February, based on ocean temperatures, even closer to neutral. By March, things starting to make the flip. Then into April and May, the most aggressive modeling center on Earth going after the next El Niño is actually the Bureau of Meteorology, which is again in Australia. This is mimicked by what we're of course watching here in the United States. The likelihood that this La Niña is right at its peak and will start to fade through the month of January continues to be resolved by the CFSV2 model. That's a model again in the US, and also what the European model is suggesting. So this means we're going to make a transition from now going into spring, and I want to talk to you about what that means. Winter is going to be volatile. It just is. It always is. But once we get into spring, we have to ask, what will the jet stream be doing? And I showed you this earlier, but let's come back to it again. This is the newest update we've got for seasonal forecasts, and this is coming out from Columbia University, where they have their IRI multi-model probability forecast engine. And it's looking at April, May, and June. And as you look at this, about the only place where there's been consistently a call for drier conditions has primarily been down here in the desert southwest compared to normal. Their anomalous precipitation patterns outside of that area have not been strong or leaned one way or the other. Now, you might be looking here and say, what about New York getting into parts of Quebec or Vermont, New Hampshire? This is it's an interesting signal that I can't yet fully know why it is there. But I guess I would say I don't necessarily anticipate it. Now, I want to complement this with something else, because should we lose La Niña, gain El Niño-like behavior, I even think this might be too dry. I think it's going to be more active than what's going across the country right now. So let's give you the official forecast, as it says at the top here, from the CPC. Let's go ahead and look again at their temperature forecast for January, February, March. They're suggesting some southeast ridging. That's typical should we have the ocean pattern we've got now. So there is still going to be a La Niña flavor to this. Well, if we do keep that, that's what you should expect here. And when there is cold, it's northwest cold. It's Canadian prairie cold, and they're going to get let out like you saw. But let's go back here instead and look at the precipitation pattern. This is still very La Niña-like, despite the risk of losing La Niña soon, in that the Ohio River Valley is very active and the Pacific Northwest is very active. But what we need to do is we need to just go out there beyond this, and let's say, what about that April, May, and June time period? Now, the models are suggesting a more mild spring. That's because if we have an El Nino at this point, it's more zonal flow rather than meridional flow. And if you go back and say, what about the precipitation pattern April, May, and June? You see that it remains quite wet in the Ohio Valley. Near normal precipitation for a lot of other places. And likely, if there is going to be a drier location, will it be here in parts of Colorado and New Mexico, or farther back into like Arizona and Mexico? That would be the adjustment that I would make based on analogs. But you see, these are what the longer range forecasts are kind of currently pointing at this particular point. Okay, so from here, let's just remember what could happen should we flip this whole thing over to become an El Nino. During an El Nino, there tends to be better rising motion in this portion of the world and better sinking motion here. So that's why we tend to think of El Nino years as being, well, better years in terms of moisture delivery for the crops that are grown from April into May and June here in the Northern Hemisphere, in North America. This could run the risk also of having tighter planting windows if you have a more active, more zonal jet going into spring. So that is my latest thinking as we look out there past this winter and beyond, because we've talked about winter a lot in the most recent videos. This is now at least a preliminary idea about spring. Now, what's interesting is the temperature graphic from the beginning of this year up until today. You can see that California has been very warm, Arizona to Texas, and then down into Florida. That very southern tier has been quite warm, but many locations are actually going to be measuring on the normal to cooler than normal side this year. Again, very cold spring across much of the northern tier of the United States, and then a cold fall that has come after this. And of course, right now we know that just this afternoon, in fact, let's get an update on this map. Just this afternoon at 5:20, we're watching the front continue advance through Michigan and Indiana, right here to Kentucky, Tennessee, and all the way down to the Gulf Coast in Texas. And just thinking about this and looking at these temperatures, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine this afternoon, Arlen Suderman, and I said, he's a wheat expert. I said, what is there anything I need to be thinking about here with this wheat? Because the temperatures that have changed across the hard river and wheat belt, just comparing yesterday to today, some places here are almost 60 degrees colder today than they were yesterday. And you can see the leading edge of the front here late this afternoon into this evening as it continues to advance, dropping temperatures off, in some cases 30 to 40 degrees compared to where they were a day ago. We've watched as that front advanced. This is just as the sun was setting here. We were watching as this low began to develop. Actually, it's still developing here over Michigan and eventually into Ontario. But I was intrigued by what I saw coming through, again, that hard red winter wheat belt. So looking there, something that was interesting was as the cold air came through today, let me take it back, there's sunrise. We actually saw on the leading edge of the cold air what we call an undular bore. You can actually see the waves in this. These are all gravity waves that were produced as this very cold and very stable air kind of put this little shock wave through the low levels of the atmosphere, and you can see it in effect there. If you got my morning report, this is what it finally looked like when the sun rose. Just incredible to see that. But I came back a little bit farther north into Kansas, and I just wanted to see how much snow actually came out of this. So very heavy up here in parts of Colorado. But then as you get out into Kansas, you can see there was a dusting of snow there. So if I just show you the last 72 hours of total accumulated snowfall, there were a few places here that picked up an inch, maybe 2 inches. But the farther to the north, the snowfall amounts were heavier. And then, of course, the heavy snows were in and around the upper Midwest. Now, this was only valid through this morning, so we've since added a little bit more here, and of course the snows come through Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and parts of Michigan this evening. So we're going to keep watching out for that as we go forward. But he said, well, let's just look up a graphic that shows wheat's resistance to freeze injury. So here we are almost in January, and the injury temperatures are down there if you get temperatures below -5. So just thinking about that, I went and looked at the K-State Mesonet, and we see a lot of temperatures right now, that are hovering around 0 Fahrenheit. But it's a reminder that this morning, this is what the low temperatures were, something close to this, down here in this minus 13 to minus 15 range. So given that, I know it's about duration. We didn't have enough snow on that wheat, and it got quite cold there this morning. And as you'll see tomorrow morning, we expect temperatures to be down in that minus 6 to minus 10 range with minus 17 as you get here over into parts of Colorado. That cold air, there may be some winter kill issues. I would love to hear in the comments, or if anybody wants to to tell me what you've seen. I'm not an expert in this. I can report the data, but I'm not a wheat expert. What I do know is that Friday morning is going to continue to see that colder air advance farther to the east. And as we get into Saturday, again, another just big push here of colder air going farther and farther east. So that's Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Things start to become a bit more mild across much of the west, but still the cold air is anchored in this area. Watch the end of this, though. As we go from Monday into Tuesday and Wednesday, we start to see more mild air that's returning. And it's at this point that the Pacific jet stream is making that big push. And that's really going to start to change our temperatures over more mild as we finish this year. But before we go any further, I want to talk about the current system, because right now we still remain with blizzard warnings out for a large section of the Northern Plains, Upper Midwest. This is all winter storm warning in through here, wind chill warnings, freeze warnings, and this is all going to be pushing through New England here very soon. And on the backside of it, there's an ice storm we're watching out for in parts of Oregon, Washington, and some heavy snow with the next system coming in there. So why don't we start with the winds here? This was tonight, 6 p.m. We're going to watch this large wind field continue to press east. Gusts will be somewhere in the 30 to 50 mile an hour range. Sustained winds around this low will likely be here, in the 20 to 35 mile an hour. That's the sustained winds, with much faster over the Great Lakes. And that's going to last all the way through Friday afternoon and evening, which is where I am now, going out into Friday night, into Saturday morning. And this animation will end out here about 6 p.m. on Saturday night on Christmas Eve. And you're going to continue to see during that time period very, very strong winds in and around the Great Lakes states. So that's what we're expecting, and that's why the blizzard warnings have been issued for a lot of that area. Now, as of 6 p.m., the front was clearing like we talked about Michigan and Indiana, and the snow behind it tapers off very quickly. A lot of the snow is very fine powder coming in on this Arctic air. And as we go forward, we're going to see rain spread into New England out of the mid-Atlantic, where we did see some very heavy rainfall this morning in this area. But that front continues to press east, gets up against the Appalachian Mountains here. The low begins to develop over Lake Huron, and the strong winds are seen in that tight spacing of the isobars. Now, what you're going to notice behind this is a lot of lake effect snow. And we could see, for example, in Buffalo or here on the Tug Hill Plateau, and then, of course, the lake effect belts in Lake Superior, Huron, and Michigan could get several inches of snow out of this. And that's going to last through Saturday and then probably into Sunday morning on Christmas morning. But if you've watched one system, we need to make sure we understand what's going to happen with the one that follows it. So I want to take you back here and show you we have a front that's going to slam into tonight into the Pacific Northwest. And there's a very shallow layer of cold air in here that's going to have temperatures below freezing, while the upper level temperatures are more mild off the Pacific. And as that spreads snow into the interior parts of the Pacific Northwest, there'll be a freezing rain event that occurs right in through here. And that lasts as we play this forward out into Friday. And we're going to continue to see wetter conditions going through Saturday and even into early Sunday morning in the Pacific Northwest. So a lot of mixed precipitation, hence the winter storm warnings here. I did pull up a sounding just to show you what things look like near Portland. When you look at this, I'm going to trace out a line for you. See this blue line here? That one represents the freezing line going up in the atmosphere. So this large warm pocket is the mild air coming off the Pacific, while the near surface air temperatures are below freezing, hence the freezing rain threat that's in that area. And this is the probability just over the next 72 hours. That gets us, of course, through the evening on Christmas on where we expect to get at least 1/10 of an inch of ice. So treacherous travel in this particular area as well. Now, before we kind of get too much further, I do at least want to show you through Christmas night where we are expecting snow. So we're going to start off in the Northwest. And again, you can see some of the heavier snow in and around Spokane, the Northern Rockies, the Blue Mountains here, and then some in the Columbia Basin. But on the other side of this is kind of the latest snowfall outlook, again, through 6 p.m. Central Time on Christmas Day on what to expect out of what's left from this system from the National Digital Forecast Database. So quite heavy in the lake effect snow belts, but at the speed of this front, putting down an area in through here of 3 to 5 inches of snow coming out of Illinois over into parts of Indiana and Ohio. So that's what we're going to be watching here. From this point, I want to do my multi-model analysis. So we've already seen up to here, okay? So as we play this forward, the next low that comes into the Pacific Northwest, and we saw that one hitting as well, is going to send a clipper out of Alberta into Saskatchewan. It's actually in both models. That will come down through the northern plains and through the Midwest. This will be on getting out to Sunday. Could spread some light snow. Can you kind of see the area I'm talking about? I'm watching right in through here in both models. And then after this, that kind of curls through the eastern Corn Belt, not delivering too much snow. But after that, all attention is going to go to the west. Because by next Tuesday, we're going to be watching. Yeah, there's a weak clipper that comes out ahead of it. It is in both models right here across the southern Canadian prairie into the northern plains, upper Midwest of the U.S. But multiple deep low pressure systems, strong onshore flow in the west, begins at some point on the 27th. We're just going to see system after system come across. Now these will eject, and they will make use of the open moisture coming out of the Gulf. But as we're going to see here in the models, just multiple chances of bringing systems into the west, delivering that moisture. And you say, well, what's driving all of this? Well, it's this. This is the change that we're starting to see in this particular pattern. Okay, from there, let's get an idea on how much total precipitation. So as I play this forward through the weekend and then get it out there, let's just park this out 1 week from now. You notice at the end of this animation how much is expected to start to come into the western United States. And that's going to set us up for a very active end of 2022 and beginning of 2023. To compare this to the GFS model, this is the GFS, so European GFS. If you notice, they're quite similar. And when we subtract one from the other, we don't actually see too much difference overall, except that the European's a bit more aggressive with the southern track of that first clipper and then bringing in the moisture sooner into Oregon and California than the GFS is, although the GFS wants more snow in the Sierra Nevada. From here, just watch this. I'm just going to use the GFS because they're quite similar. See this high latitude blocking, the high over low? As we go forward, watch that just go away by next week. And you're going to see just we sometimes call this a parade of lows, multiple troughs just hammering into the western United States. And that pattern is going to give us a fast jet stream. It's going to build a lot of warmth in the east, and it's going to make the week 2 precipitation pattern look like this from the GFS model. So much above average precipitation here where the Gulf is open, wet across the west, and that is mimicked by the newest European model, a long-range outlook. Now, real quick, to show you what the temperatures are going to do, I should have pulled this up. This is how they're going to look. The temperature forecast is echoed pretty well in both models. This is the day 5 through 10 pattern. So now, day 5 through 10, that ends 2022. And the beginning of 2023, it's got very mild conditions off to the east. So very mild for this time of year. So that's kind of our near-term forecast wrapped up. We talked about the long-term at the beginning of this. Where I'd like to finish today is giving you a quick update on what's happening in South America. Now, overall, when we look at the last 2 months in Mato Grosso, you actually see drier than normal conditions. But that was all because of a dry time period right here at the beginning of November, and then 2 other shots in November where it was dry. But that was when they were planting the crop or finishing it. What's happened since then is that the slope of this line really matches average. And so the moisture in Mato Grosso is quite good. Mato Grosso do Sul, very similar outlook. Goiás, which is in the east, if we can get this to pull up here, it looks quite good as well. Maybe that one's not going to pull up for us. Where there's been some problems has been, if we go down here to Argentina. And in Argentina, what we've got here is that there's been kind of systematic dryness punctuated by just a few decent rainfall events overall when you look across the whole of it. So when we kind of break those 2 regions down, we do see that there have been a few places over the last month that have been a bit drier than normal in Mato Grosso and Mato Grosso do Sul and down into Rio Grande do Sul, where there's been some trouble with the full season crop of corn down here. But even though you see this dryness, there's still been quite a bit of moisture on key agricultural areas that is offsetting some of this dryness. Into Argentina, this is where we look back over the last couple of months and we just see a bit more regions in here continuing to struggle with drought problems. Where it's been heaviest in terms of the rainfall has been pretty far to the south, just looking at this one metric. Now, recently, just in the last day, we did see better rains, but a lot of this has been too far to the east over toward, the west, over toward the Andes Mountains. So this is Buenos Aires, Cordoba, Santa Fe, Entre Rios. These are the big ag areas growing corn, soybeans, and other crops, wheat included, that we need to keep an eye on. Okay, thinking about that, let's just step through what we expect the precipitation to do using today's 12Z run. So what we've got here is this weekend, Friday into Saturday, there is a front coming through. It's going to be producing widely scattered showers and some thunderstorms. And that front then pushes north and interacts with the monsoon, which, remember, the monsoon kind of flows around like this. But after that front clears Argentina, going through much of next week and beyond, there's not another front that's really forecast. So things stay drier after that. The wetter conditions kind of anchor right into this particular area. So that's why when you look at the next 2 weeks, we see wetter conditions Bolivia into Paraguay, much of Brazil's main growing areas. We've seen a wetter trend from Paraná down even into Rio Grande do Sul. The region that just seems drier, even though there's moisture coming through this weekend, goes right back into this part of Argentina. Notice that Buenos Aires, that province, may possibly have wetter than normal conditions going over the next 15 days. But we're just kind of continuing to put stress in form of a lack of precipitation into Argentina going forward. So just for perspective, the likely total precipitation here in Mato Grosso over the next 15 days could easily top 5 to 6 inches and even more than that. So that's how wet it is there. Last thing I want to finish up with, I got asked today, when is this going to break? And we need to get La Niña to shift. We need the jet stream winds in the southern hemisphere to respond. Because looking here at a pressure index called the Antarctic Oscillation, we've seen that since September it has mostly been positive. And when it's positive, we reduce the effect of fronts coming across Argentina, which deliver the rain. And the forecast going forward is for it to continue to be positive. So that is one of the big reasons why we're concerned about the longer-term drought issues in Argentina, because when you correlate in January and February against the AAO, the Antarctic Oscillation, when its values are positive, we tend to see dry conditions here, wetter conditions to the north. So that's the break that's going to have to occur. I don't think it'll occur until La Niña fully lets go, which brings me back to the beginning of this video where we said that's probably going to happen within the next 30 days. So expect there to be change at some point beyond mid-January in this precipitation pattern. Hey, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I know that I have a great audience that listens to my forecasts. I just appreciate that. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I love doing this, and I hope we have a great 2023. We got a lot to keep discussing, and just thanks for tuning in and listening. So have a great Christmas, have a good start to 2023, and we'll catch up then. Thank you.